hear the interview that I did just a little bit earlier with Simon Clarke, the Chief Secretary to the Treasury. And it won't surprise you that I did start by asking him why the Chancellor hadn't increased universal credit and benefits in line with inflation to protect the poorest.
Well, this is a very serious situation, as you say, being driven by factors which are largely out with this or indeed any government's ability to control, notably the COVID pandemic and Russia's aggression in Ukraine. In terms of how we're supporting people, there's obviously a range of measures which we're taking, some of which have already been announced, which are going to be hugely important. So increasing the national living wage, making sure that we're taking action on fuel costs, on energy costs, but also changing the taper rate for universal credit as well, from 63p in the pound to 55p in the pound. Those are all massively important decisions. Today, we've set out that we're doubling the size of the Household Support Fund, which is help for the most vulnerable families. That's going to £1 billion. And obviously, we are very conscious of the fact that we will keep bearing down on the burden of tax across the piece. So there is a lot of help here against what is a very difficult and fast-moving backdrop, which I think will be of comfort to people at a time when no government, as I say, can cure all of the challenges that we're facing.
But you didn't actually ask the question why you haven't increased benefits.
Well, we've had to make decisions about how best to deploy the resources that we have available to us, and it's our verdict that this is the best possible package that we can put forward.
But even despite that package, your own forecasters are saying that living standards are set to fall by 2.2% in the coming year, the largest fall in living standards on record, certainly since the Second World War.
Well, as I say, these are very challenging times. Our job is to make sure that we ease the cost of living as best we can. We've spent £400 billion responding to COVID. We're now faced with war in Europe, with all the disruption and dislocation that is generating to supply chain and the spooking of the markets, particularly oil and gas markets, that has resulted. Against that backdrop, it's our job to try and make sure that work pays, that businesses can invest, and that we share the proceeds of growth as fairly as we possibly can. And those are the central tenets of the plan that the Chancellor has set out today, which means that we are cutting fuel duty, we are cutting national insurance, we're making investing in green energy improvements cheaper, and obviously we set out our medium-term ambition to cut income tax in 2024 as well. So there's a lot that we are doing here to support families, without in any way pretending that there are easy answers to these massive challenges.
But, I mean, just on that, Chancellor says it's really important that you hit your target of balancing the books by the end of the Parliament. But actually, again, your own forecasters saying you will meet it with well over 30 billion to spare. And, that is 30 billion, at least some of it, that, poor households need now.
Well, we have to be really conscious of the volatility of this situation. The OBR themselves have been clear that in their document that this is a almost uniquely uncertain landscape, and we have very little margin for error here. Roughly speaking, a 1.3% rise in the cost of borrowing would wipe out all of that headroom. And a 1.3% rise in the cost of borrowing really is not unimaginable in the current climate. To put it in a different way, we're going to spend £83 billion in the next financial year on debt interest. That's 4 times what we paid last year. Set against that level of risk, we have to be prudent and cautious in what we do here.
No, I agree with you. I mean, most people would say spending £83 billion on interest rather than on schools and hospitals is, well, appalling, some people would say. And let's be clear, this has happened while we've had Tories in power since 2010. This is your mess.
It's not our mess. It's the result of a pandemic and a European war. And I'm afraid that those have come with huge costs. We had literally just got the public finances back into good order in 2019, having won successive general elections on a clear plan to bear down on the consequences of the 2008 crisis. We have then been hit by events which nobody could have anticipated and which bring with them costs which are entirely of a different order of magnitude and entirely of their own making. These are not policy choices that are unfolding here. Inflation is higher in the United States than it is in the United Kingdom. Inflation in the Eurozone is almost exactly comparable to the UK. So these are not uniquely British challenges. We're trying to do our best to manage the fallout.
They're not uniquely British challenges, but I'm going to get slightly technical for a second. It was a policy decision of successive Tory chancellors to borrow in an index-linked form, to borrow in the form of index-linked bonds. That is one reason why the interest bill is going up. Those were Tory chancellors' decisions. Similarly, it was Tory chancellors who underwrote the decision of the Bank of England to buy government bonds. That's another reason why your interest costs are going through the roof. These are Tory chancellors' mistakes.
No, these are the decisions that were taken in good faith to try and best manage the pressures, the extraordinary pressures of recent years. We spent £400 billion responding to the COVID crisis. And I don't think there's a single viewer out there, frankly, Robert, who will believe that a Labour government would have been more cautious in their management of the public finances than the Conservatives over recent years. I think in the hypothetical scenario where John McDonnell had been Chancellor for the last 2 years, I think state spending would be of a different order of magnitude again, and so would our vulnerability to interest rate shocks. So I don't think that's a fair criticism. We've been faced with some appallingly difficult outcomes over recent years. Despite that, we've now got unemployment back down below 4%. We've got the wider economy larger than it was before the pandemic. And we're now using the headroom that's available to cut tax. National insurance is being cut by £330 for 30 million people. There's a plan to cut income tax. We had the largest ever cut to fuel duty. These are all material bits of help for families at a time when, as I say, we don't have the ability to completely magic all of these inflationary pressures away.
Now, I just want to read you something else from the your own forecaster's book. It says that higher inflation has already eroded the real value of departmental budgets that were set in cash terms in October by between £5 billion and £17 billion at a time when departments like the NHS, like the Department of Education, schools, are still dealing with desperate backlogs. I mean, when you announced your spending plans in the autumn, this was all supposed to be about clearing those terrible backlogs, for example, of NHS waiting lists. That's all going to take a lot longer, isn't it?
Well, we're really clear that the departments are going to have to innovate and deliver efficiencies to live within the settlements that have been set out, which are hugely generous. I mean, departmental spending...
But less generous than they were because of inflation.
But departmental spending will still be £150 billion a year higher by 2024, 2025 than it was at the outset of this spending review. That is a huge increase in public expenditure. And it does give massive resources to departmental secretaries of state to drive their important work. For example, the Department for Health budget is in the region of £180 billion by the end of this Parliament. That is a colossal sum of money, and there is no sense in which this is austerity 2.0. Quite the opposite. We are generously funding our public services.
But the targets for reducing, for example, NHS waiting lists, actually the targets for increasing defence spending were all based on much lower inflation figures. I mean, the IFS calculates that just rising petrol reduces essentially real resources for the army by about £500 million.
We're very conscious of these inflationary pressures, and indeed we're giving the NHS extra funding in the form of the new health and social care levy to bear down on those waiting lists.
The army went the time when it really matters.
Well, the MOD was given the largest settlement since the end of the Cold War in 2020, and that's a 4-year settlement. It was designed at their request to be heavily front-loaded, so it was roughly speaking, 9% increase in the first year of that settlement to allow them to drive those major equipment procurement programmes which they so need.
Government is a massive employer, nurses, teachers, inflation devastating their take-home pay. Are they just going to have to live with a cut in pay this year?
Well, we have a wider responsibility to all taxpayers to make sure that we manage the public finances responsibly, and everybody in both the public and the private sector is going to have to play their full role in helping the country through this crisis. It is really important, clearly, that pay restraint is observed across the public sector. We're not freezing public sector pay. There will be pay increases, but we're not in a position where we can start paying out 8, 10, 12%, and it would be wildly unrealistic to expect us to do that. We have a responsibility to manage the public finances responsibly, precisely as the Chancellor has set out, to allow us to deliver our clear plan to reduce taxes and to continue our important programme of investment in public services. The only way we will be able to make that plan work is by managing the public finances responsibly over the course of the next few years, and that does include the important dimension of pay.